There is a city in the world where when you step onto the street, you're no longer sure where you are. Not because you're lost, but because the language spoken around you is not English. The smell of food is not American, and the large murals on the walls tell stories of distant islands thousands of kilometers away. And the street signs don't bear the names of American generals or politicians, but the name Bob Marley. This is Brooklyn, a borough of New York City, and within Brooklyn lies a neighborhood that exists nowhere else on this earth. People call it Little Caribbean, a miniature Caribbean, where over 560,000 people of Caribbean descent live in this one borough alone. The entire city of New York has a population of 8.8 million, and over 20% of them have roots in the Caribbean. That number is larger than the entire population of many of the island nations they come from. But this isn't a story about ordinary immigrants. This is a story about geography, about how a small sea nestled between North and South America created one of the most complex and prolonged migrations in modern history, about how distance, ocean currents, shipping routes, and then flight paths pulled millions of people from sun-drenched islands to a snowy, icy city in the north, and about why New York City, not any other city, became the unofficial capital of the entire Caribbean region. The question is, why New York, and why is this more important than you think? Let's look at the map. If you place your finger on a world map and find the Caribbean, you'll see a collection of over 7,000 islands, large and small, stretching in a giant arc from Florida down to Venezuela. This is the region known as the Caribbean Sea, a body of warm, blue water that for centuries has been the center of some of the world's greatest geopolitical conflicts. If you draw a straight line northward from the center of the Caribbean, that line will pass through the Bahamas, run along the Atlantic coast, and point directly at New York City. That is not a coincidence. It is geography. From Jamaica, one of the largest islands in the Caribbean, to the port of New York is only about 3,000 kilometers by sea. This distance is much shorter than the route to Europe. From Haiti or Puerto Rico, the distance is even closer. During the era when steamships dominated, New York was the largest and busiest port in the United States. For Caribbean people seeking a new life on the mainland, New York was both the nearest port of arrival and the largest economic hub. There was no more logical choice, but geography only explains the first step. The rest of the story is much more complex. On a map of the eastern United States, if you draw a triangle between Florida, the Caribbean, and New York City, you will understand the geographical structure that created this entire migration. Miami, at the southern tip, is closer, warmer, and later became a destination for Cubans. New York, at the northern tip, is farther, colder, but larger, and offered more economic opportunities. For over a century, these two cities have divided the Caribbean community in different ways, and the reasons lie entirely within the map. The Caribbean Sea is not just a natural boundary, it is a pathway, and for many centuries, that pathway has led to New York. But before understanding why millions chose to come here, you need to know what pushed them to leave. The Caribbean has a history inseparable from violence and empire. From the 16th century, these islands fell one by one into the hands of Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands. The Europeans did not come here to settle. They came to exploit. Massive sugar plantations sprang up everywhere. To operate them, they brought millions of people from Africa as slaves. This was the largest slave trade in human history, and the Caribbean was its epicenter. That is why the population of the Caribbean today has such a unique demographic structure. It is primarily composed of descendants of African slaves, mixed with the indigenous Taino and Arawak peoples, and later, immigrants from India and China who were brought over as indentured laborers after slavery was abolished. When slavery collapsed in the Caribbean, Britain abolished slavery in 1833, and the Americans followed in 1865. The free people had nothing but their freedom, no land, no money, no opportunities. Meanwhile, the United States was experiencing an industrial boom. The factories in New York needed workers. The port of New York needed manpower. And young men from Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad heard that call from their islands. The first steamships carried them north. And here is an interesting fact that few people notice. The first Caribbean person to set foot on the land that would become New York did not arrive in the 20th century, nor the 19th. They came in the 17th century, in the year 1613. a man named Juan Rodriguez from Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola. He became the first recorded non-native person to settle in New Amsterdam, the original name for New York. He was Dominican, the son of a Portuguese father and an African mother. He arrived here even before the English, before the city even had its name. Nearly 400 years ago, a Caribbean person made the first footprint on this land. The first major wave of migration arrived in the late 18th century, when the Haitian Revolution erupted. From 1791 to 1804, the slave revolt in Haiti was led by Toussaint Louverture and later Jean-Jacques Dessalines. They overthrew French rule and created the first nation in the world founded by former slaves. This was an event that shook the entire Western colonial system, but revolution creates refugees. White Frenchmen, free people of color, and even slaves fleeing the violence all found their way to the United States. Many came to New York. It was a small wave, but it sowed the first seeds that truly grew from a construction project. In the early 20th century, the United States decided to build one of the greatest engineering marvels in history, the Panama Canal. In 1903, the project began, and to complete it, the Americans needed a massive labor force willing to work in harsh conditions. They turned to the Caribbean. Over 200,000 Caribbean laborers, primarily from Barbados and Jamaica, were recruited to Panama. They dug the earth, built the locks, died from malaria and accidents, and finally completed the project in 1914. The Panama Canal opened, and then the labor market collapsed. Over 200,000 people were suddenly jobless. Where were they to go? Some returned to their homelands, but many, especially the English-speaking Jamaicans and Barbadians, decided not to return to those impoverished islands. They looked north, and to the north, at the end of a familiar sea route, was New York. From 1910 to 1920, a wave of Caribbeans from Panama poured into New York. They sought out neighborhoods where other black people were living, primarily Harlem, in Manhattan. And here, history began to turn. Harlem, in the 1920s, was one of the most magical places of the 20th century. From all over the American South, hundreds of thousands of black people had fled the Jim Crow segregation laws to go north in search of freedom and opportunity. This was called the Great Migration, and in Harlem, this stream met the Caribbeans who had just arrived from Panama and the islands. From that collision, the Harlem Renaissance exploded a cultural revolution of Black America in art, music, literature, and thought. Caribbeans played a significant role in that explosion. By 1930, nearly a quarter of Harlem's population was from the West Indies, and from among them emerged a figure who changed history. Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican. Garvey arrived in New York in 1916, founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and turned Harlem into the center of a global black self-determination movement. He introduced the concept of returning to Africa and mobilized millions of supporters in the U.S., the Caribbean, and Africa. But more importantly, he ingrained in the Caribbean psyche that New York was a place where you could become someone, that from a small island, you could speak to the whole world. That was the message that generations after him would remember. Meanwhile, on the political map, another decision was creating an entirely different stream of migrants. In 1917, the U.S. Congress passed the Jones-Shafroth Act, granting U.S. citizenship to all Puerto Ricans. No one asked the Puerto Ricans if they wanted it. This was a purely geopolitical decision. The U.S. needed Puerto Rico as a military base in the Caribbean, and granting citizenship was a way to ensure the loyalty of the island's people. But an unforeseen consequence was that Puerto Ricans could suddenly come to the US freely, without visas or immigration quotas. And New York, just over 2,700 kilometers from Puerto Rico, was the closest and largest destination. In 1920, there were only 7,000 Puerto Ricans in New York. But then World War II happened, and everything changed. Tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans served in the US military. And when the war ended, many decided to stay on the mainland. Flights from San Juan to New York became cheaper and more frequent. This has been described as the first great airborne migration in American history. After the Korean War, in which another 61,000 Puerto Ricans served, More than 430,000 Puerto Ricans poured into the US mainland, with the majority choosing New York. By 1950, Spanish Harlem and the Bronx had become the largest Puerto Rican communities outside the island. The language, culture, and music, especially salsa, permanently changed the sound and soul of New York. But that was only the first part of the story. The second part began with a gunshot. On May 30th, 1961, Rafael Trujillo, the dictator who had ruled the Dominican Republic for 30 years with violence and fear, was assassinated on a road outside the capital, Santo Domingo. 8 bullets ended a regime, and the largest migration in Caribbean history began. For the 30 years Trujillo ruled, Dominicans were not allowed to leave the island. A passport was a privilege, not a right. Those who dared to disagree disappeared. The regime controlled everything, from the press, the church, and families to the future itself. When Trujillo died, everything fell apart at once. It wasn't just the absence of a dictator, but the dissolution of the entire social order. In 1963, the democratic government of Juan Bosch was overthrown in a coup. In 1965, civil war broke out. Then the US sent in troops. Amid that chaos, tens of thousands of Dominicans sought a way out. And they came to New York, not Miami, not Los Angeles, but specifically New York. Why? Because before them, the Puerto Ricans had already arrived and established Spanish-speaking communities in Washington Heights and Corona. The language is the same. The culture is similar. When you arrive in a foreign country and can't speak the native tongue, you first look for people who speak your language. And in New York, a reception was waiting. In 1970, there were 61,000 Dominicans in New York. A decade later, another 109,000 arrived. And between 1980 and 2000, the Dominican population in the US grew by more than 500,000. 2/3 of them lived in New York City. Washington Heights was unofficially renamed Little Dominican Republic. Dominicans became the city's largest immigrant group, but as they were arriving, another flow was forming from the poorest island in the Caribbean. Haiti is a story of cursed geography. On the map, Haiti and the Dominican Republic share the same island of Hispaniola. They share a border on the same landmass, but if you look at a satellite image, the boundary between the two countries is starkly visible. The east is lush and green. The west is barren and pale, with deforested lands, eroded soil, and people living in chronic poverty. Haiti has a history that, once you hear it, makes you understand why people had to leave. After the revolution of 1804, Haiti became the first nation founded by former slaves. But France did not forgive. In 1825, France sent a war fleet and forced Haiti to pay 150 million francs in reparations. This was an amount equivalent to nearly $30 billion today. Haiti had to borrow from French banks to pay it, and that burden weighed on the country for over 100 years. That is why Haiti is poor, not because Haitians are inept, but because they had to pay the price for their own revolution. And then, in 1957, François Papa-Doc Duvalier came to power. For the next 2 decades, Duvalier, and then his son, Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier, turned Haiti into a living hell. The Tonton Macoutes' secret police spread terror. Thousands of people disappeared. Intellectuals, journalists, teachers, doctors, anyone who could challenge their power was killed or forced to flee. And where did they flee? New York. The number of Haitians who came to the U.S. in the 1960s was only 4,816, mostly in New York. But between 1970 and 1980, as the Baby Doc regime escalated its violence, the number jumped to 92,000. By 1990, there were over 225,000 Haitians in the US. The majority settled in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and that area remains the largest Haitian community in the world outside of Haiti to this day. During that same period, on another Caribbean island, a completely different story was unfolding. Cuba lies just 145 kilometers south of Florida. Geographically, Cuba is closer to Miami than to New York. And when Fidel Castro came to power in 1959, a wave of Cuban escapees poured directly into Florida, especially Miami. By the end of the 1960s, Miami had 500,000 Cubans, turning the city into the unofficial capital of the Cuban diaspora. New York had Cubans, but they made up only 14% of the Cuban population in the US in 1970. Geography dictated that Cubans went to Miami, while the Anglophone and Hispanic Caribbean went to New York. This is a geographical paradox, few realize. They are all Caribbean people, but depending on which island you come from, which route you take, and which language you speak, the map leads you to different cities. But among all these migration flows, there is one wave that is less mentioned, but particularly impressive: the Guyanese. Guyana is not a country on any island. It is on the South American mainland, bordering Venezuela and Brazil. But culturally and historically, Guyana belongs to the Caribbean world because it was a former British colony. Its population consists of descendants of African slaves and indentured labourers from India, and its official language is English. In 1966, Guyana gained independence from Britain, and almost immediately, a wave of emigration began. From 1969 to 1976, an average of 6,000 Guyanese left the country each year. That number increased to 14,000 per year in the following period, as the dictator Forbes Burnham ravaged the economy. And they came not to Florida, not to California, but to New York. More specifically, they came to Queens, settling in Richmond Hill and South Ozone Park. That community grew so large that in 2021, the stretch of Liberty Avenue running through it was renamed Little Guyana Avenue. At this point, if you look back at the demographic map of New York at the end of the 1980s, you will see the most extraordinary thing. In less than a century, a city in the northeastern United States had become the largest Caribbean city in the world. Its scale was larger than any Caribbean capital, not Kingston in Jamaica, not Port-au-Prince in Haiti, not Santo Domingo, but New York City. It was once said that Harlem, in 1930, aside from Kingston, Jamaica, was the largest Caribbean city in the world. Let that sink in. But why did these people choose to stay instead of returning? This is the part of the story that geography cannot fully answer because there is a second pull factor, one as powerful as geography: community networks. When the first waves of Caribbean people arrived in New York and settled, they didn't just build houses, they built systems. Mutual aid societies emerged, such as the Barbados Association, the Trinidad Association, and the Grenada Association. These societies helped newcomers find jobs, find housing, and fill out immigration papers. Caribbean churches sprang up in Harlem and Brooklyn, grocery stores selling food from home, hair salons, pharmacies, and schools. When the second wave arrived, the third wave already had people ready to welcome them. This is what sociologists call chain migration. One person arrives first, gets established, and then sponsors relatives later. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 particularly facilitated this. When the new law prioritized family reunification over national origin, the Dominicans who arrived first sponsored their parents, siblings, and relatives. The Jamaicans did the same, the Haitians did the same, and so it went, one wave after another. Researchers have calculated that non-Hispanic Caribbeans have the highest naturalization rate among all immigrant groups in New York. 62.9% have become US citizens. When you are a citizen, you can vote, participate in politics, and more importantly, you can legally sponsor relatives. This is when community becomes a pull factor stronger than geography, and by the 1980s, Caribbean New York was no longer just about migration, it became political. In Brooklyn, electoral districts with large Caribbean populations began electing their own representatives. Una Clark, a Jamaican, was elected to the city council. Her daughter, Yvette Clark, succeeded her and was later elected to the US Congress. Mathieu Eugene became the first Haitian American to be elected to the New York City Council. The Caribbean community doesn't just eat, live, and work here. They are governing parts of this city. Every year, on Labor Day in early September, the city's largest event takes place on Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn. It is the West Indian Day Parade, one of the largest Caribbean festivals in the world outside of the Caribbean. From 1 to 3 million people gather, flags of dozens of island nations fly in the wind, and the music of soca, reggae, dancehall, and compas fills the air. The smell of jerk chicken and roti wafts from hundreds of stalls. This festival did not start in Brooklyn. It began in Harlem in the 1920s, initiated by the Trinidadian community, and in 1969 it moved to Brooklyn, because by then, Brooklyn had truly become the heart of Caribbean New York. There is a little-known fact about this community's cultural power. In 1960, in the East Flatbush neighborhood of Brooklyn, a child was born named Jean-Michel Basquiat. His father was Haitian, his mother was Puerto Rican, and he grew up amidst Caribbean languages and Caribbean culture. And from that collision, Basquiat created one of the most unique artistic styles of the 20th century. Street graffiti combined with oil painting, Haitian voodoo symbols and Brooklyn street slang, black history and critiques of capitalism. His paintings now sell for tens of millions of dollars, but they were born on the street corners of Brooklyn, a place where English, French, Spanish, and Creole blend together every day. It is a product of geography, history, and migration. Today, if you walk along Church Avenue in Brooklyn, codenamed Bob Marley Boulevard, you will see a large mural of Toussaint Louverture. At the corner is Nostrand Avenue, codenamed Jean-Jacques Dessalines Boulevard after Haiti's founding father. Those street names are not accidental. They are a declaration that we built this place, and this place belongs to us. But the city is changing, and that change, once again, stems from geography. Miami is on the rise. In the past decade, Miami has surpassed New York in the proportion of its Caribbean population. That city has a little Havana, a little Haiti, a little Santo Domingo, and a climate closer to home. The cost of living is lower than in the increasingly expensive New York, and the geographical distance from Miami to the Caribbean is much shorter than from New York. The migration trend is gradually shifting southward, but New York remains the symbolic capital of the Caribbean diaspora. Not because of geography, but because of history, because of its 400-year depth, from Juan Rodriguez to Marcus Garvey. From the Panama Canal workers to the Basquiat generation, New York is where the story of Caribbeans in America was written. When you look back at this entire story from the beginning, you realize one thing. It all started with a map. The Caribbean is close to New York, the sea routes are favorable, the trade winds blow in the right direction, and the port of New York is the largest in the Americas. Geography created the possibility, but it was the history of empire, slavery, dictatorship, poverty, and war that turned that possibility into a reality. And it was the people, the communities, the mutual aid societies, the mothers sponsoring their children, the cooks bringing recipes from home who transformed that reality into a vibrant culture. The story of the Caribbean in New York is not just a story of immigration. It is a story of how geography determines destiny, and how people can rise above that destiny by bringing their entire world with them to a new place. And if you want to understand that with all your senses, you just need to go to Brooklyn and walk along Bob Marley Boulevard on a Saturday morning. When the music is already playing and the aroma of food is in the air, listen to the city speak to you in dozens of languages at once. That is the sound of geography telling its story.